Our next speaker is Dr. Navid Taghvaei. Did I say that correctly?
Great job.
Okay, great. Dr. Navid is a board-certified doctor of audiology, and he's been a resident of Arizona since 1988. He conducts very complex individual and group technical training courses and activities involving new and existing developments in the areas of audiology, products, software, and technology. Dr. Taghvaei has extensive clinical experience in pediatric and adult hearing instrument and cochlear implant fitting, programming, and rehabilitation. He's served as a practicing clinical doctor of audiology in multiple multidisciplinary otolaryngology and audiology clinics in the U.S. and internationally. He received his doctorate in audiology and master's degree in hearing science from the University of Louisville School of Medicine. He's also served as a lecturer and clinical preceptor at Arizona State University and the University of Louisville for audiology and psychology courses. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. Hello, everybody. Really a pleasure to be with you all. First of all, can you hear me okay? Good. My job really to sort out some of the research that's out there, and much of this is not product specific actually, and talk about things that you can leave with and take it into your practice and be more successful with your patients. More patient-centered and those kinds of care that I think we all value and know that are important. Just a little bit about me. I'm a lead clinical education specialist for Signia, WS Audiology, actually. So I dabble in all of our brands. So they pay me to do this. That's my disclosure. Okay. I also want to recognize Dr. Brian Taylor, who I think a lot of us know, an audiology industry leader, and this course would not have been made, actually, without him writing it, so I really appreciate him doing this, and it's my pleasure to introduce this information to you. Just to give you some direction on what I'm going to talk about, and there are essentially 4 or 5 questions that I'm going to address in my presentation. And what I want to talk about is lived experiences of hearing loss. So we're going to talk about what that means. What do I mean by lived experiences? And how can you more effectively assess individuals' lives and the experiences that they go through. I'm going to make the point that we only look at a very small sliver of the person's life and their experiences and the routine assessment battery that we have in the clinic and we all use on a daily basis with our patients. Only looks at a very small portion of their day-to-day experience and what they're dealing with in terms of communication difficulties with hearing loss. So also, we don't have a lot of good tools. That's also another reason why it's really a sliver of what we're looking at. So until recently, and I'd like to present some of that information to you as well, to look at more broadly of the experience of our patients. And we're going to talk about normal aging, how it affects the auditory system, and also I want to contrast that with normal aging and to conditions like dementia and Alzheimer's. And why is it, and how important is it to empower our patients? So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the concept of empowerment with our patients. And so it's really important because it's a way to take the focus off of the technology, no matter what kind of hearing instrument, cochlear implant, your manufacturer you're using, and focus on really the individual. And that's my goal as well. So at Signia, at WES Audiology, we developed some really good tools that you can use in the clinic to better understand how empowerment of the patient is, on the long run, good for everybody, of course, but specifically for the patient. So these are the questions I'm going to attempt to answer today. Let's see. So let's talk about, what I also want to do is kind of start a little bit about the anecdote of some of you may have experienced in your own lives, certainly patients that share similar stories at home, like this one. So please feel free to stop me if you have heard this before. We all know that Thanksgiving is coming up, great American holiday. And of course, millions of homes around the country, I think this scenario is going on. So let's imagine, being maybe this is grandpa, maybe he's a veteran, maybe he's, and since we're in Southern California, I'm just kind of drawing these out of my hat. And everybody at home during dinner can tell that there is some hearing loss. He's not following the conversation. He's maybe interjecting on some topics, changing to off topics, and these are not related to the conversation that's going on. So that's a very dead giveaway. There is some hearing loss, some misunderstanding, and maybe somebody asks him, have you heard from Faith recently? Maybe his cousin, right? And, of course, Grandpa gets a little bit irritated, says, yes, I washed my face this morning. So, that's just an example of kind of things that patients with hearing loss and their families go through on a daily basis. I think this reflects more of a challenge in their daily lives, or the problems that they face, and they've been dealing with in terms of, oftentimes, and that's what I mean by lived experiences. So we're going to talk about what happens when people deal with this and conditioned for years and years that they have to deal with these issues with communication problems. Of course, the obvious thing, they don't hear very well. They misunderstand, and that's the kind of situation what we're dealing with. But there's also an emotional aspect to this. There's an impact that, it's actually, some are physical, there are some emotional, there are psychological. And these are the things we have to deal with that are kind of resulting from this long-standing hearing loss. So anyway, that's my little anecdote, what I mean by lived experiences, and let's go through what the actual, if you will, sequence of events is. So it starts, of course, with gradual hearing loss. You go on for some time, and there is some maybe negative emotions attached to that. So let me ask you a question. Before, you notice the problem and you take action, right, if there is a hearing loss, how long do you think it takes before that happens? The old 7 to 10 years, right? So it's actually been studied a few different places. Last study I saw, which was really well done, University of South Carolina Medical School, and they figured it was about 8.9 years that it took for some individuals to actually get help with their hearing. Now, of course, that is even worse in certain populations. So if you look at people in rural areas who maybe live by themselves, minority populations, these type of individuals actually wait almost 15 years before they get any help with the hearing, and whether it's amplification or other types of help. So 15 years, that's a lot. whatever the number is, 10 years, 5 years, 15 years, I think we all know one of the repercussions of that gradual hearing loss is, what comes down to that Thanksgiving dinner and not being able to communicate with your loved ones when it really matters. Makes those silly mistakes. People laugh at those mistakes, of course, but then, those are annoying. They're frustrating for the person with hearing loss. And they're more likely to happen, and of course, then you have negative connotations that are attached to those. So that's what I mean by these kinds of, 10 years or 15 years. It really has to do with these maladaptive behaviors. And what I mean by maladaptive behaviors is withdrawing, not wanting to go anywhere, not wanting to communicate with anyone. It's harder than pulling teeth to have those people actually engage in communication. So it does impact quite a bit. And that's kind of the process that this happens. Of course, if you look at audiology, there's a couple of key points I want to make here in respect of their lived lives, but also in our field, we are really the one of the only professions where we spend so much time with our patients. If you look at how much time we spend with our patients from a ability, a lot of time, for the ability for them to be able to actually take advantage of the hearing aid and the communication strategies that we're trying to deliver. This takes some interaction, but if you compare our profession to any other profession in the healthcare sector, maybe not psychology or professional counseling, because that's really the nature of their job. But if you compare it to just physical medicine or optometry, the amount of time we spend with our patients is really unmatched out there. So I think it's important to point out that by the virtue of the amount of time we're spending, well, you may say I'm not really rushed, but I know we are rushed. I also see patients, and so I know how much time we have to spend to drive the important things that we need to drive in a clinic. And so, of course, over a number of year or two, this becomes quite the investment. And one of the things I'd like you to take away from the little talk I have here is maybe with an extra 5 minutes or extra 10 or 15 minutes that we can take away from all of that time we're spending with our patients. And that, what I mean by that is administrating a couple of self-report or inventories that are out there, and I'll introduce some that may be new for you. You can get a lot better view of how our patients are handling their lives, what their listening experience is, and understand that patient that comes into your office a little bit better. So physical, psychological, and social, all of these are components of the life experience of our patients, and it's not just hearing aspect. So we typically assess, of course, a small part of this, as I mentioned, of this lived experience. And we are equipped to look at more of a holistic approach and look at the patient from a patient-centered approach. What do I mean by this? I talk about normal aging, and I put normal aging in the objectives. I want to spend just a minute here talking about, there's been a lot of conversation, of course, in terms of a lot of chatter in terms of the hearing loss, dementia. We still really don't know that much about it. There's a lot of theories why hearing loss and dementia are related. A lot of theories about whether the hearing aids actually prevent or slow down this process, specifically with dementia. And I'm not going to get into that research, that's not my goal, but I'm guessing that you all have familiarity with some of the research that's been out. So, for example, the John Hopkins Achieved study that was throwing around 48% reduction in cognitive decline in terms of certain populations. But there is a little controversy there, as you may have read already. There is, it's kind of reflective of when you use percentages, sometimes it's a large number and that might look impressive, but you do need to have some statistical measures to really interpret that correctly and draw correct conclusions from that. Anyway, setting all of that aside, I think there's really two different populations, especially when you're working with adults over the age of 60. You have, and they're reflected in terms of what you're seeing on the graph here. So on the y-axis, you're looking at cognitive ability, of course. And then we have time on the x-axis. And so between the populations of people that have been diagnosed with dementias, the curve slows, of course, much more sharply than the top curve, which is your normal aging individuals. So one point here is that both groups decline, right? Both groups decline, of course, both much more markedly so for those with dementia. And that's not surprising. There's, real take home is that the percentage of people who we think on average experience normal aging, they reflect that top curve. And anybody want to throw out a number in terms of what percentage of people that is, in terms of what that top curve represents? What percentage do you think would normal aging versus dementia? 50%. Good guess. Any others? So 87% of individuals in our population are actually normal aging. So that means, I think that's kind of interesting because the important thing of this is to, the context, because we look at how much the professional literature, we see this stuff on mainstream media, take it from New York Times or NPR or other outlets, they're out there. And, it's important, but it's only about 20%, not even 20%, maybe 10% of the population that's going to be diagnosed with that condition. So the point there is these two different populations, and one is vastly outnumbering the other, and your clinic, you're going to see a lot less of these people who have dementia than you're going to see people who have normal aging. And that's my focus here today, is just look at that process. And, because of the media, we're bombarded with this, so we feel like, oh my gosh, now it's like every other person has dementia. But when you look at the data, it really is quite lopsided. As I mentioned, almost 90%, in fact, are going through normal aging. So that doesn't mean everything is hunky-dory, of course. It means that we have to do a better job and to be able to understand better normal aging process and how it might actually impact experiences with hearing loss. Okay, and that's what I want to talk about over the next few slides here. So another question that I think we need to talk about is of normal aging in terms like successful aging. What do I mean by that? This 87% population is going to successfully age. That means that, if there was 50 people in this room, you can do the math, right? Now, I know that, successful aging may have different definitions out there, so I just brought some information in terms of what we're talking about with successful aging. We have to account for, of course, physical changes in the body. Last time I checked, hearing and our ears are part of that body. And we need to account for the psychological aspects of successful aging as well. All of those emotions we talked about, in fact, probably going to be more negative for persons that are gradually experiencing hearing loss, than those that may have had the sudden loss, for example. So successful aging really is how does somebody stay mentally sharp? How do they stay psychologically strong? They stay positive. How do they stay socially connected to their network? Now, do we have hearing that has a role in that? Of course, hearing has a major role in that. We all know that. How would we apply these skills to actually help a person age successfully? So it's more than just improving their thresholds in the audiogram, having them hear sounds, or it's, I dare say, more than using Verifit to verify the target of, and of course that's very important, but it's really more than that. It's really the entire lived experience and how hearing contributes to their social, psychological, and physical aspect of their health and wellness. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but this is kind of shows that hearing has an impact on all of those things. So as you can see, attitude, frame of mind, relationships, persons feeling like they're making a meaningful difference. What you do on a daily basis in terms of, these are really big deals for doing a good job, what our expectations of ourselves are, and of course, it's important for us to take care of our patients in terms of considering what those issues are. Now, what does this model tell us? And this is the holistic model. And I just shared that with you at the previous slide. So those three circles that you saw. And it reminds us really that hearing loss never occurs in isolation. So the hearing loss is not just standing on its own. It's affecting part of a person's life, of course, and how their mindset is. It also affects aspects of aging. So psychological against social. And another thing that I want to remind everybody is, hearing loss is usually a harbinger. It means that it first, one of the first things that can happen is this aging process. So snowballs, if you will, from there, and things become more of a problem with aging and with hearing loss, which is another thing to consider. So since we're all audiologists, hearing care professionals in the hearing industry, and I want to talk about this normal and normal aging process and a good amount of time these processes of the ear. So we're going to look at hearing in the auditory system. We're going to ask questions to try and answer these questions on how does normal aging affect the auditory system. So remember that 87% are likely that they're experiencing these normal aging processes that's affecting the ear. So I want to remind everybody that, I'm sure you've heard this before. The auditory system is a top-down and bottom-up process. You've heard that, right? Yeah. So top-down, bottom-up, and of course, there's repetition that's built into this as well in these challenging situations. So for example, the squelch effect or the redundancy effect or directed listening. So when I talk about the bottom-up processing, that's really nothing more than the cochlea, the middle ear, and the inner ear, gathering sound, and of course, then sending it to the brain. That's the bottom-up process. And top-down, of course, is the cortex and the language centers of the brain. And using this knowledge then of language to make sense of it. And of course, top-down is really important when you get into noisy places and don't hear very well, don't understand speech very well. And the next point is really, as you age, there are two things that impact in a negative way. Bottom-up processing, and then one thing that impacts the top-down processing that I'll talk about. So these three things we're going to talk about next, and we go through this. I want to kind of think about when does normal aging start to become evident, or, if you will, observable? Does it happen when you're 60? Does it happen when you're 80? What is the predictions that we can make based on the research that's been done out there? So we're going to talk about, theme of this next several slides here, and this is the first phenomenon or the first condition that impacts the bottom-up processing, is this extended high-frequency hearing loss. This is, of course, more granular look at the perspicuous, that, if you want to call it that. We're looking at these extreme high frequencies and the sensitivity and the cochlea, and then you see here on the graph, you'll notice the frequency on the x-axis that goes out to 16 kilohertz. Anybody doing high-frequency audiometry here? Sometimes? Okay. Yep. And, some people dabble in it, and that's fine, and I'm not suggesting you go out and buy equipment to do high-frequency audiometry. But at the same time, if you have the equipment, I think it would be wise, and I'll show you some information on what I mean by that. So on this slide, what you see is 5 different age groups. You have 18, 22, all the way up to 41 to 65, excuse me. And no surprise, that green line that you see is representing the oldest group there. So quite extensive, extended high-frequency hearing loss. But also what I want you to pay attention to is that black rectangle. There are individuals that I would say pretty darn young, and some of them are not even 30 yet in this graph, and some have extended high-frequency hearing loss. And so, of course, in the clinic, somebody comes into your office, they say that, I don't hear very well in background noise, and they're in their 20s, they're in their 30s, likely to have this kind of issue, which, of course, we can't pick up if we're just doing audiometry out to 8,000 hertz. And that reminds me, actually, some really interesting research being done at the VA with Dr. Alyssa Davidson. I don't know if you have heard of her, but they're looking at central auditory processing and extended high-frequency hearing loss. So they're designing this to kind of triage, to start with tinnitus management or start with hearing loss management. So the questions, in terms of identifying individuals that might have trouble communicating as a result of either or, and they've asked four questions. If somebody scores poorly on it, they find that those people abnormal audios through 8K and hearing loss. You can see that many of them actually do well with hearing aids, which is kind of interesting, even though they don't have hearing loss out to 8,000 hertz. So anyway, another important point to notice is that these changes were, we see in the extended high-frequency hearing loss, they happen in the 3rd decade of life. And, 3rd decade of life is not your 30s, it's your 20s. So a few other things about extended high-frequency hearing loss. As I mentioned, annual needs for equipment, so that's one thing. And this, of course, is the prevalence. So this is some data that was collected by a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. So their age group is 18 to 64. And it's a pretty broad range. 64% of the people in that age they think they have extended high-frequency hearing loss. So over half of the individuals, and if you look more carefully at the younger end of the spectrum, 18 to 30, 56% of them have some extended high-frequency loss. Again, it's showing up in your clinics. I don't hear very well. In background noise, these are the complaints that they have. Noise can do a number on my understanding of speech. and you can tell the person has normal hearing, but come back in a year or so is usually what we tell them. But this may be happening that is kind of flying under our radar. So extended high-frequency hearing loss is definitely one to consider in terms of this process. Okay. That brings me to the next phenomena. So that's part of the, normal aging, of course, of the cochlea, the bottom-up problem. And that's what I want you to pay attention to in that white square. So we'll talk about the spectrogram. Some of you probably are already familiar with spectrogram. Everybody know what a spectrogram is? So coding of energy of speech of any sign. So this is something that the frequencies are on the y-axis on this graph. And notice that I work for a school system is, I think, what the phrase is. And there's a lot of energy in the very high frequencies. There's a lot of S's in there. So above 7,000 or 8,000 hertz. And the point I want to make here is if you cue in on to the white box, you can see all of that energy inside that box. And that was well before, we talked about the temporal construction of this. So if you will, a guy by the von Bekesi, I don't know if you remember from our old audiology, right? And he mapped the cochlea. And so I think in the 60s, he actually got a Nobel Prize for that. But my point is that was kind of the understanding of how the cochlea and the resolution deals with the spectrum. And it was the prevailing theory until the tonotopicity of it all the way down to the cortex. 20 years ago, hearing scientists, this was in the UK, I don't know if anybody's heard of Brian Moore, but he looked at what's happening underneath the traveling wave and the activity basically taking all of the sound energy you see here and that white box, and it's remarkable. So if you look at the cochlea and the transferring of the energy is sort of the same way that the energy is traveling in the ear. So the cochlea takes it and sends it, codes it and sends it to the brain. So a visual of a temporal fine structure of speech, and that's what you see here on the right side. And so the red line is kind of hard to see, but on top of the graph, that's the wave of the traveling wave of the cochlea, and the squiggly lines, the little blue squiggly lines, are called the temporal fine structure. And what Brian Moore discovered back in 2006 was that as we age, this temporal fine structure, all the squiggly lines, and the blue sort of area of the graph starts to fade away, and that's essentially the result of normal aging. So that a person doesn't hear very well, they struggle in background noise because it's temporal fine structure that allows us to discriminate. That becomes a problem as it's going away due to aging. Very similar sounding words, so that you're able to pick up one way, at least through the temporal fine structure code. You lose that through the process of aging. So he actually developed a test to measure this temporal fine structure. You're probably familiar from graduate school with the SISI test and the minimal masking. It takes 30 minutes, so we would never be able to do this in the clinic with our patients. But there are tests for this that they use in the research labs. And it is for the research lab. He found that, as we get older, this hearing doesn't change very much through age, but then, again, people show up in their clinics saying that they hear well, but then it's in background noise where they struggle. Their hearing is essentially normal, but they hear speech-less in background noise when there's adverse listening environments. Things maybe sound muffled. So, question you may be asking yourself about what age it is that we commonly start using the temporal fine structure. And I'll hold you in suspense a little bit at what age that is, but please think about that and what age you might think that is. Any numbers you want to throw out there when we start to lose this temporal fine structure? 30s? Okay. Any others? We'll have the answer a little bit later. But it's hard to think that young we could be using our temporal fine structure, but I think you're on the right track. So some of what I've already talked about, but those are two bottom-up phenomena that are related to normal aging, and virtually everybody experiences this by the time they reach that age of retirement, if not earlier. Okay, let's talk about the last one. This is a top-down normal aging condition, and that's the auditory cortex reorganization, of course. So you can see there on the right panel, there is little areas it's labeled B, and the cross section of the brain. So that little area with the red almond-looking thing, that area is, of course, in the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and it glows bright when you have a functional MRI and there is sound being played. And so you don't even have to be paying any attention to the sound. It just processes that sound as soon as there's any sound. Now, part of the auditory system that sends, in the cortex, that little diamond-shaped area, it'll glow bright, right? And when you add more sound, make it more complex, you talk about speech coming into play. Then you see those bluish and pinkish areas in the cortex. And if you're on the younger side, and meaning under the age of 40 or 50, that is what it looks like. So you have a little bit, as you get a little bit older, then it's likely that those pinkish and bluish areas aren't going to light up as prominently as they would with younger hearing individuals. So maybe age of 75 has some hearing loss, maybe mild or moderate hearing loss. And if you conduct a functional MRI, you'll probably see that the red almond-shaped area is glowing. And the other parts, particularly vision, have taken over if there is no amplification. And that's, of course, cross-modal plasticity. So, and I'll talk about this in just a second in terms of actual evidence for this, but other senses, so these are other senses in the brain, are taking over those areas that are not being utilized by the auditory cortex. And how does this show up in the clinic? Again, the same way we talked about before. I don't understand well. I mix up words. I can't hear in background noise. Those are the complaints that this kind of issue would bring to our clinic. And here's the key point. I think it's important to when you first have somebody with hearing aids and the possibility of reactivating this auditory system, you're turning it back on and you're reversing this process. So when you fit somebody with hearing aids, you have this profound ability to actually change the person's brain, which is, of course, we kind of know this through schooling and all of this stuff, but if you sit back and think about this, there's some new research out of the University of Colorado. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Anu Sharma. And so she's discovered in her lab, this is a few years ago now, this reversal effect that the brain doesn't do if the hearing aids are fitted improperly even. So I'm not just talking about unaided, but hearing aids that are not aided properly. So two things have to happen when you fit hearing aids. Hearing to ensure that you're actually seeing this reversal of plasticity, because remember, if there is hearing loss, those areas of the brain that were responsible for processing those sounds that are no longer heard are being taken over, in this case, by the occipital lobe, which is our visual cortex. And so, does anybody know what those two things are to make sure that this process happens? What are the two things that we have to have for this remigration or going back to actually occur with people with hearing aids? One is what do you advise your patients to do as soon as they get hearing aids? Wear them all day long, right? So in fact, they said that more than 6 hours a day would be, on the average, this full-time hearing aid use that they would expect. The second is to have ample audibility for soft sounds. So, which means that it's really important to match a gain target, and this is what I was mentioning earlier. It's super important to, of course, verify the fittings. But here's another piece of evidence showing that it is extremely important to match targets, especially for soft sounds. So enough audibility, especially for those soft, high-frequency information. So those patients are likely to experience reverse plasticity. And anybody know who Gus Mueller is? He actually is a 30-year consultant for Signia, and I have the privilege of working with him from time to time. And he uses this example of you literally have the patient's brain in your hand, and you are, in fact, reprogramming and rewiring that brain, and we have that evidence now through Anu Sharma's work. So be very careful on how you fit hearing aids, of course, and that's as much as what I want to talk about with age-related normal aging that relates to these changes in the brain. So let's go to how do you account for these physical changes. So, you don't have to rush out and get extended high-frequency audiometers. You don't have to learn Brian Moore's temporal fine structure test if you don't want to, which of course takes 30 minutes. But there is some way that you can sort of screen these changes. Remember that almost all of these patients, regardless of the problem, bottom up or top down, all of them kind of show with this constellation of symptoms and problems that they cannot hear well in background noise, and it keeps coming up regardless of whether it's a top-down or bottom-up process. Problem is understanding in background noise, understanding speech in background noise. So I think it's sensible to sort of screen for these conditions, and to be doing some sort of speech and noise testing, I think is really, really important, and I'll present to you some information on why that is. My recommendation would be to, all of you actually use this Quixen. Anybody use Quixen here with their patients? Excellent. So it's a great way to find out if somebody has one of these age-related conditions that might be impacting them. You're not going to know which one of the conditions, but you're going to be pretty close in terms of knowing that there's functional problems in the auditory system. So those of you who are not schooled in Quixen, takes 5 minutes or less, really, conducted under earphones. It measures something called signal-to-noise ratio loss, and which I'll talk about in just a second. And each ear is done separately. And don't go rushing to get a CD. I don't think you'll even find those CDs anymore. But it's very likely that your audiometer already has it embedded in its software. So anyway, you'd see all of these people that had, if you will, benign audiograms, like a flat 40. Hearing loss, they come in, 80% word discrimination, and you think, this person should do pretty well with hearing aids. And of course, all I have to do is make things audible, and then you do a quick sin and you find out they absolutely fall apart. And so this can change the tenor of managing that patient's care and the counseling and the items that we're actually talking about and how we assess the communication challenges that the patients have. So let me try and convince you with some data here. So I think it should be completed routinely with every single patient, even patients who are not, a hearing aid candidate necessarily. And this is some data I'm going to share with you from Matt Fitzgerald. Anybody know who Matt Fitzgerald is? He's the head of audiology at Stanford Ear Institute, Palo Alto. He's been conducting Quixin research for some time now with the 10 audiologists on his staff that he has, up to more than 10,000 patients now. This data is from a couple of years ago, so it's actually only 7,000 patients, so forgive me for the lack of 3,000, but I think it stands strong. So what you see here is the relationship of the high-frequency pure tone average on the x-axis. And now there you see these high-frequency pure tone averages. These are together high, normal, greater than 15 dB. High-frequency pure tone average by low, normal, and then mild, moderate, and so on. And then you see y-axis, so the degree of what we call SNR loss, signal-to-noise ratio loss. So the numbers go down from 0, which is normal, 0 to 2 is normal. Then you have numbers that go downward in the y-axis, so the greater the signal-to-noise ratio loss, the more a person falls apart in the testing. And so what I want you to pay attention to is actually this group in the red rectangle. They all have normal audiograms. Notice, most of them have normal to mild sensorineural loss, but a fair number of them, even people who have what we'll call high normal thresholds, greater than 15 dB SNR loss, they don't really do well in background noise. So you wouldn't know that those persons struggle in background noise simply just by looking at their audiogram. That's my point. And actually, on the contrary, you probably say that this person does pretty well in noise and with voice. And, even though they might be complaining of not being able to hear in background noise. So that's that population. It actually gets even more interesting. So this right scattered plot that you see, relationship between the word recognition and NU6 words, and compares it to the person's Quixin score. So the right ear of those 7,000 people that I mentioned, notice that the word recognition gets worse. There's a trend where SNR loss gets worse as well. But look at the group right here. So if you see the rectangle, overwhelming majority of these people in the clinic have good or excellent word recognition scores. So that's represented by that the red rectangle. And so what that means is in quiet, so how many of those individuals, despite the fact that they have good or excellent word recognition, are doing poorly with background noise? So again, can't look at somebody with word recognition in quiet until they, and then tell them how they would do with hearing aids and background noise. As you can see with the evidence, really, especially for the group that's designated with that red rectangle. So you get some really interesting, powerful information with this research. And And Fitzgerald, his group at Stanford, actually they were awarded for this research. I don't know if you know, but at the American Auditory Society, they worked and published 3 papers on this, and it's an excellent piece of work, and I'd recommend you going after it. But the point is that there's really strong correlations between, and actually they've developed a protocol to replace the word discrimination testing in quiet with Quixen as our word testing, speech testing. So they start with the Quixen, and when it comes to speech audiometry and the person's hearing, if their hearing loss is 7 or better, and their high frequency pure tone average is 40 or better, then there's no reason for word recognition testing, essentially. And of course, in a busy clinic or medical center, I think most people fall into that category. So that's a great way to save time and not lose any accuracy in your diagnosis, and that's really the bottom line there. They also found that it's better, this Quixen testing and detecting acoustic neuromas, than traditional single word discrimination testing. So again, it predicts the auditory disability about 90% of the time. So meaning that if somebody comes in complaining that they don't hear well in background noise, there's probably a 90% chance that person has a auditory disability and they need help from hearing aids. So 3 scientifically validated studies for this Quixen, and it's stood the test of time, certainly, the speech and noise test has. Here is some data from Larry Humes. I'm sure you've heard of Larry Humes. It's also important work that recognized that Quixen uses a long sentence as its testing, so that also may, if you will, the top-down component of that will match the audiograms, but at the same time, it could be the age-related component that is memory that's also in effect, because they have to remember certain words and repeat them. So this is actually around 100 individuals that all have very similar audiograms and big differences in the age. So as you can see, the score's quite poor when somebody gets into that 70s and 80s, which kind of shows you that top-down aging effect and how they show up on the Quixen. Okay, so big fan of that research. Also Larry Humes' work and how data helps us. It kind of shows us that this should be a test that we do on everybody. And I want to move now to kind of other aspects of the lived experience. So I think Quixen does a nice job of the physical aspect of aging, but again, some of those are things like, if you will, fatigue and frustration, and withdrawal and isolation, loneliness, these behaviors really, and emotions that are quite negative sometimes and harmful, and conditions that people have when they live with hearing loss for a long period of time. So we're going to talk about some self-reports and how these self-reports can help us circumvent the problem of not being able to detect these issues. So, best way to better understand some of those other aspects of the lived experience is to use what we call these self-report inventories, fancy way of saying a questionnaire. And really the only feasible way to do this is with the self-reports. There's, like I said, there are tests for some of these, but we can't spend 30 minutes at a time to test some of these issues. So what these tests should have, what the inventories or self-reports should have, is some good scientific rigor in how they are produced and validated. So it should be validated by a researcher that shows that actually, what you're saying, you're measuring is being measured. And of course, they should be easy to use, so they can be completed by the patient, analyzed by you in 5 minutes or less. That's also important. And they need to be practical. So what this means is, they have to contribute some meaningful information in your decision-making process. So those 4 key components of any kind of self-report, as you probably know. There are dozens of them. You've heard of COSI and the IOIHA and HHIE. So the list goes on and on. I'm going to talk about some newer ones that actually meet these 4 criteria that I just mentioned and help us better understand the lived experience of the patient. So back to our holistic model. Good ones, good self-reports, good inventories are designed to assess some of these things that you see here on this slide. So things like psychological items like mood and attitude and outlook, frame of mind, decision-making ability, and then, of course, social aspects like building relationships, being friend or companion, feeling valued by others. All of these are, of course, part of the holistic model. Here's one that I think should be used every day. How many of you have had patients in your clinic that came to you and said, I'm so tired at the end of the day, I just can't function, go anywhere, the social life, it's because I have to work so hard hearing in these noisy environments. So, and it's because of their hearing. So we hear patients say those kinds of things all the time in terms of they're probably suffering from what we call listening-related fatigue. And but the problem is, of course, until recently, we didn't really have a good way to measure that condition. One way to look at fatigue, of course, is pupillometry. I think you may have read some stuff out there, but I don't know who's going to do that in their clinic. It doesn't make sense, really. And that kind of, it shows why, these self-reports are needed, because it gives you some access to the degree of the problem. So listening-related fatigue in this case, and we would like, I think we all agree that real condition challenged by many of our patients that we see. We know from data that people that have listening-related fatigue are less productive at work. They're more likely to be socially isolated. They're even more likely to be depressed. And we know that older people, especially those with hearing loss, are much more likely to suffer from this condition. So there's actually been a lot of work done by a couple of labs. One is Ben Hornsby, of course, which has looked at fatigue. So let's look at that. This was developed, really a practical tool for screening listening-related fatigue. It's called the Vanderbilt Fatigue Scale. Anybody heard of this before? Good, I'm glad I'm bringing good information to you. So a great example of self-report that meets the criteria I just put before you. And it's very fast, it's validated. Notice there's 10 questions. It's not, I'm going to not go through the whole thing, but things like I feel worn out from everyday listening. I get so exhausted from listening. I can't do things I enjoy. I withdraw when I'm unable to follow conversations. I feel tired. It takes lots of energy. I feel emotionally drained. Now, if you go back to that schematic of the lived experience, the negative emotions and maladaptive behavior with respect to fatigue, many of them really capture that with these 10 questions. So imagine a person checks into your clinic before you see that question. Please.
Well, I would say with this, the questions here, I would say with these questions here that if I were to ask my patient them, they might say, yes, I'm struggling, I am exhausted, I'm this or that, and I would say 9 out of 10 of them would not have associated it with their hearing loss. I mean, I have pointed out to them that they've had listening fatigue from that, but I would say they might say yes to these, but not associate it with their hearing loss.
That's very possible. And of course, we know that there is fatigue. So in fact, on this inventory, if they get 25 or more, it's a debilitating type of situation based on Hornsby's scoring scheme. So I think along with Dr. Brian Taylor, we did a little study on this internally at my clinic in Arizona, and we had 42 individuals that were part of this study, fit them before. We fit them with hearing aids that were matched to target, of course, administered this Vanderbilt fatigue scale, and found that before the fitting, the average score was, for the 42 people that we measured, was 13. So about 15% actually had a score of 25 or higher, which, as I mentioned, is debilitating fatigue. And the interesting part, after about a month, we re-administered the fatigue scale, and they'd been wearing the hearing aids. And of course, what you see, the fatigue was essentially gone down to a significant amount to where it's no longer part of their concern. But another handicap scale that we can use is our auditory wellness. Sorry, I think I just skipped a bunch of stuff. And so handicap inventory, most people are familiar with, is probably the screening version of the good old HHIE, the screening version. And there are only 10 questions again with HHIE, the screening version. In addition to that fatigue scale, I think I would encourage you to administer the handicap inventory because the questions really does a great job of capturing what's called auditory wellness. And so, of course, it captures emotional and social wellness and how they're feeling in terms of their handicap scale. Now, there is not a huge correlation between the HHIE and, as you can see, the pure tone average. It's kind of all over the map, so it's not necessarily a linear response, but it is a way to capture those emotional aspects of the hearing loss that the patient is experiencing. Okay, and that's from Hume's 2021. I just put up the scale so that it's a little bit easier to understand. Auditory wellness, of course, is really a combination of social and emotional behaviors. So that means I wanted to, so that as much as I'll talk about with some of the self-reports, I actually have one more here that I want to show you, and I want to talk more about the value and the benefit of empowering people with hearing loss and how we can actually use empowerment, better understand with these empowered patients and better understand what they're going through, and really fuel the way that this should fuel the way that we work with patients and make decisions. So let's go back to our scenario with the grandfather who's having difficulty at the Thanksgiving dinner. Misunderstanding word. People are kind of chuckling at his misunderstanding. And let's talk about this through in terms of the lens of empowerment and what I mean by empowerment. So a person like this, how likely are they to take the initiative to actually make an appointment for an audiologist? So if you think about that scenario, people kind of chuckling and his family is laughing. And of course, he may even take the initiative, but is it that he's going to rush out the door and go buy the hearing aids? Even if he bought hearing aids, how long is it going to, is he going to accept them? Is he going to throw them in a drawer, or is he going to wear them? Just tell people that he has hearing aids but not really use them. So empowerment is really the difference between somebody who accepts your recommendations, comes to your practice, wears the hearing aids. And I'll make the argument here that empowerment is the difference between the success and lack thereof. So because it's so important, that's why we don't take the time, and it is really important. So we really should look at this in terms of how can we counsel our patients to be empowered to change their own listening situation. So what does that mean? That means that they're more likely, these empowered patients, to seek help. And they're proactive about getting help. They're more likely to make an appointment. They're probably younger. They don't put it off. And they're willing to do something about it. That's what I mean by empowered patient. They're more likely to accept your recommendations and, again, more likely to be successful with hearing aids. So empowerment and the differences in many cases, and ultimately, I would argue that in communication, patients are more likely to take control of their communication, more likely to take control of their social settings, interactions, despite the day-to-day challenges that they have. So the other kind of people that are, if you will, it empowers people to persevere, go against the odds, and take what it takes, do what it takes to help themselves. So you might be asking yourself, what are the elements of empowerment? How can I identify it? What does it mean? Well, let's go through that. What I want to share with you is 6 different components of empowerment. So these are things that you bring to the table to help a person become more empowered. And now we sort of assume that, we leave it up to the patient and they just kind of show up. And if they're empowered, then that's great. But if they're not much we can do about it. But you actually can bring a lot to the table for that person to become more empowered. And the first thing is, of course, education and awareness. Just taking the time to educate the person about their options, making them aware of all the effects of hearing loss, helping them develop those sense of urgency that they need to have to get help. That all comes from us. It comes from you. And the other is, of course, to access to technology. That obviously that's hearing aids or implants. But we'll talk about in a few minutes. There's other kinds of technology that supplement. It's not just hearing aids. And I'll introduce to you in just a moment, and you can introduce them to your patient. And then, of course, is support networks, so helping that person connect with other people in the community, maybe hearing support group. That's all part of what we can do to bring to the table in terms of empowerment. And then communication strategies, teaching them how to be more effective, use effective communication strategies in these challenging situations. Advocacy, encouraging them to speak out about their needs, to not to be shy about it, actually talk about it in a way that other people become aware of what's going on. Just last night, I was in a clinic about an hour away from here, and it was not an old and not a young, but a middle-aged first grade teacher, only using one ear, so she was wearing a bicross system, and in that good ear she had about a moderate to moderately severe conductive hearing loss. So it was, multiple stapedectomies because of otosclerosis and so on. But one of the things that I found she was missing is being empowered to actually take control of her listening environment. So we spent a lot of time talking about just telling people, excuse me, I have some hearing loss. If you look at me when you talk to me, we'll have a better chance of communicating. That kind of stuff to take control of that situation. And finally, kind of fostering a positive mindset about their hearing aids and using overcoming the challenges related to hearing loss. Positive mindset in terms of, We talk about, it's huge, and we'll talk about some of this in just a moment, but there's a lot of fiction out there and a lot of strong negative biases in terms of what hearing loss is and hearing aids and their benefit. And so we'll talk about it in just a second, but let me ask you this. How empowered is the individual that's seeking help from you? If you ask those kinds of questions, how empowered are they? How do they know? Are they empowered? Do they have a lot of empowerment now on their own? Or is it something that can be developed? Are they kind of person that is going to persevere, or are they kind of a shrinking violet and they're going to just run away with the challenge? Please.
So I think one of the things that you're missing here is that we have to let our patients know that we are on their team. I'll give you an example. After my hip surgery, I went to PT. And so the guy's giving me, or I do this exercise, do that exercise, he's walking away. I said, what do we do next? He goes, we don't do anything next. You're going to do this. I never went back. I'm an empowered woman. I know what I want, and I could have been very successful. And actually, when I found a PT place that was like that, I was extremely successful. But you have to let them know. I mean, you can say all these things, you can do all those things, but you have to let them know that you're on their team to help them get better.
Absolutely. 100% agree with that. If the trust isn't developed from the get-go, none of this really matters. If the patient doesn't understand that you're an advocate, shoulder to shoulder, going through this journey with them, you're exactly right. None of this really matters. So that is critical in this step. No question about it. So another tool that we have to actually measure this, what I call empowerment, and I'm proud to say this comes from WS Audiology Labs. This was done in Europe. It's called the EMP-AQ5 self-report. It's a 5-question self-report. And I'll just read them. It's a little small. And the point is that you can administer this, you can ask these 5 questions, and I'll tell you, not only this person is empowered or not, they're likely then ready to take up a challenge or not empowered, and you know how to go about bringing that change. But what aspects of empowerment do they maybe need help in? That's a good question. Are they motivated? Are they empowered, like you said? Or are we starting from scratch? They're way on the negative side. So let me just kind of take time to go through these 5 questions. And so these are the things, So I know that to get help, if there is any problems with my hearing, I use tactics to help me communicate in challenging situations. My hearing loss doesn't stop me from taking part in social activities. I can control how I respond to challenges I experience and resulting from that hearing loss, and I'm confident in my ability to manage problems. So you can see that they're looking more broadly at this aspect of empowerment, kind of breaking it down, and we can see where we might be able to help them and help that person to get stronger in those particular areas. So bottom line is that the 5 questions, they take the focus off of technology, as I mentioned kind of at the outset of this, and the hearing test itself, and focus the individual really does wonders in terms of, technology is there. We all know that. We all know that it does what it does. But, it's beyond the audiogram. It's beyond the hearing test. It's beyond the technology. It's actually a lot of this stuff that contributes to the success of the patient. So puts it in focus in terms of the individual when you ask these questions. So 4 possible answers here, as you can see. Just to kind of give you a couple of examples here. It was kind of hard to read red boxes. It's a score from a person that was participant in this study. So you're seeing that this person, because they're answering strongly disagree, they're not empowered. The person is likely going to be, shrink in the face of these challenges. They're going to give up easily. They're likely to be negative. Maybe they come back to you and saying it's not working, I hate this, those kinds of things. So what do you do when you see something like this? Well, some tactics you can use with a person who has low level of empowerment on this empowerment scale is an opportunity to manage these negative emotions and their perceived powerlessness. So opportunity to, what I would say, accentuate the positive. And I'll share with you another WS audiology study that kind of brings this to light that I think really tells this story. So this was a study done in our Orca lab in Europe. We have a couple of Orca labs, one here in the States in Chicago and another one in Denmark. So this was under the direction of a researcher by the name of Dino Lechik. And this is really interesting, actually. She took about 20 people, all matched for age, hearing loss, and technology. And in one group, she fit them in a routine way. So they sent them home after she essentially counseled them, did the routine follow-up, and that was it. And then the second, they called positive focus group. They called that group. They actually pinged these people through a WhatsApp. They gave them a WhatsApp, and they gave them a message about once or twice a day, and asked them to record the positive experiences they had with hearing aids. So I guess maybe the best way to understand the power or value of something like this, think about how many of those patients you have, maybe come back to you, and by and large, they're doing really well with their hearing aids, but they might have one situation that is really negative for them. They fixate on that, and usually, I don't hear very well in this particular situation, super challenging situation. And so if they fixate on that situation, then it just snowballs from there, and it becomes more of a negative experience, and only focusing on that one particular thing rather than 90% of the other things that is going right. This happens fairly more, I would say, than we realize, the so-called negativity bias, and we know that a large number of our patients have, this is kind of study that can reverse that kind of negativity bias. So the control group, of course, and then the focus group, people who are asked to record all of the positive experiences, and we had for 3 weeks, so they used this WhatsApp for 3 weeks and reported their positive experiences through the WhatsApp, as I mentioned, a couple of times every day. And as they focused and then reflected on this positive listening experience they had, for the 3 weeks period, what they found was on the right, you can see actually on the graph, you can see the control. So closer to me, they used the COSI as an outcome measure for this particular study. So remember, on the COSI, it's a 5-point scale. Worse is no different, slightly better, much better with hearing aids. And notice the average of the control group was actually no different with the COSI, whereas the positive focus group, they were, pinged once or twice via the WhatsApp, as I mentioned. And so notice the average was 2 categories. That's 40% higher for those people that were encouraged to focus on the positive aspects and reflect positively on their experiences. And the interesting part, I think, is that it's done in real time. So other thing is that they found that even though they asked them to stop recording in 3 weeks, so after that 3-week period, they no longer had to record anything on WhatsApp. 6 months later, they had this positive focus group, still had 40% improvement in the COSI, in the measurement. So carryover effect for a long period of time is real with this kind of tool, and it can really help us put the patient on the right track if you feel like they have issues with the negativity bias and are not empowered to make a change with their hearing loss. Okay, let's go on another one here. This is, okay, so you can see that the disagree on a couple of related tactics. So the person, communicating these challenging situations, those are individuals that you can probably empower by simply introducing access to supplementary technology. So if you already are using hearing aids and they're working the way they're supposed to, in addition to hearing aids, there are things that we can use to supplement what they're experiencing. So supplemental technology, these are things that work in combination with hearing aids. And a good rule of thumb essentially is for this, if the Quickson score is greater than 7, it's an opportunity to introduce these supplementary technology, and they will work well. So the reason I pick 7 is because, of course, with the best directional system in the industry, it doesn't matter who makes it, the maximum, really the improvement is about 7 dB. And so if someone is worse than that, they might need assistance above and beyond that. So that's where that number is coming from. Okay, or if you were using the SSQ-12, 5 mean score or greater than 6.8. Okay. Anybody heard of this app called SoundPoint? Sorry? So this is actually available on your phones. You can download it, I think, from the Google Play Store or at the App Store. It uses crowdsourcing, so it uses GPS to locate noisy and quiet public areas. So you'll be able to find out through the app, and it gives you a lot of red actually for areas that are very loud and not good for communication, but tells you that a place that you'd probably want to avoid because it's noisy. Great way to for patients to select places that are easier to listen. One other would be live voice to text app. If somebody's in a challenging listening situation, so they have an SNR loss greater than 7, as I mentioned, they probably could benefit from a little extra portable kind of closed caption on their smartphone. There are different ones. I just happened to pick this by randomly. Assuming that they're, of course, savvy enough to be able to carry a smartphone and use it, that's another ball of wax. So those are for those people, or maybe even for the patient who's really ambitious, they're really empowered, maybe auditory training, oral rehabilitation. These actually are gamified exercises. They boost the person's ability to do better in background noise. A couple, Ear Gym is one. There's a free version. You can actually subscribe for a full version. And then finally, we have remote microphone technology. I think, again, if the SNR loss is greater than 7, and I keep going back to that because unless we do speech and noise testing, none of this is, it's a moot point. We don't know where the patient is at. As I think you're well aware, you can have a person with two people with the same exact hearing loss, and one can absolutely fall apart in background noise, and the other will perform vanilla as we would expect them to. So speech and noise testing is, I think, critical, and I'm glad to present the information right here from California and the research that they're doing. I think it's fantastic work, and I invite you to consider that to replace your word discrimination testing. Yes, ma'am.
Actually, there was just a patient this last week who was in his early 30s and a consultant and was having so much difficulty in dinner meetings and restaurants, right? But his hearing was completely normal, 10. And his SNR was really good. I think it was like 3, 5, it's fine. But he was saying, well, can I just go get a regular amplifier or TC? It's like, that's not going to help.
Right.
It's going to amplify all your noise anyway. But,
Yeah.
But you can't, do you ever get these people? we can't really fit them and give them any benefit from
Well,
those extended.
I'll answer your question with a question. For those kiddos that have central auditory processing disorder and they have normal hearing, what do we do for them? We amplify it, right? I think it's about giving them an edge, and that edge may be actually better than what somebody with normal hearing and processing needs, but for them, it works. So not for every single one, of course. I'm just painting a broad stroke here, but I think we try it. We don't lose anything by trying it, right? And we try different type of strategies to see what works with that patient. It's a difficult case, no question about it. Yeah.
It's hard because they need the best technology.
Yeah.
It's been $7,000.
Yeah, that's another thing is with technology, unfortunately, prices go up, and that's a challenge, no question. Absolutely. Please.
That brings my next question. So with this EHHF, has there been studies with over-the-counters? Because we do see a lot of patients, when I see them, they have it already. So they
Yeah.
put it on the counter. Can you give me something better? So have they done studies? I know, they've been in the market for the past 2-3 years. I just wanted to know about it. So we'll let patients know.
So the one study that I saw on LinkedIn, I promise this is not a plug for one of our over-the-counters, but I saw a study with Sony that Signia private labels their over-the-counter instruments, and now this is specifically about performance and noise, okay, and it beat prescriptive hearing aids. Now, there's all kinds of controversy with the way that they did this study, but my point is that unless we know how it performs, that particular over-the-counter, and now FDA has guidelines on the parameters where these are supposed to operate, and there are some manufacturers of diagnostic manufacturers like probe mic measurement manufacturers, Verifit is one of them, that has a protocol now to test over-the-counter instruments and see if they meet those targets that the FDA has placed for them. So that's a place to start to see if it's actually doing anything. Of course, we can always run a curve and see, is it actually meeting the needs of remember I was talking about those soft inputs, and if those soft inputs aren't heard, that whole process of remigration and reversing of the plasticity that has happened isn't going to happen based on Anu Sharma's research. So my feelings are mixed with over-the-counter, to be completely honest. I think it's good that, now maybe it increases access for those people who need it. But another point is that, perhaps with those lower-level technologies, we can introduce assistive devices which are not as costly as a higher level technology, if that makes sense. And so with people who are struggling in noise and they have the very basic level of hearing aid, maybe they don't have the budget to go to a higher level of technology, but perhaps a few $100s can get them. And I know that there's lots of assistive technology, remote mics that are available in addition to what hearing aids they have, and that really now puts them at an advantage way above, in fact, hearing aids if it's a remote mic. So maybe assistive technology would do the trick, but I don't have the exact answer for you. But I think it is a challenge, especially in our in our field right now with different kinds of hearing aids. Yes, sir.
Hi, just to follow up on that one, the same. So say if someone in his 50s and perfectly normal hearing, and then say they want to move forward with hearing aid use, what do you suggest, advise us as providers to use which fitting formulae? Do we have to stick with the company proprietary algorithm to first fit, or BAL 1 and 2?
This is a great question. So this question goes to the heart of, do I fit the manufacturer's proprietary algorithm, or do I fit the traditional algorithms like NAL, NL2, and DSL version 5? And what I'll tell you about that is that if anybody from any manufacturer, and now I'm making a broad statement, comes to you in your office and says, if you don't fit to our proprietary algorithm, you lose all the magic, turn around and run. That should not be the case. I can tell you that that's not the case with Signia. So if you choose to fit to a DSL version 5, NAL version 2, you don't lose anything. You still get the processing that we have in our latest technology. So I hope I answered your question there. I think it's important to, if you're going after audibility, we all know that manufacturers are not good at, their proprietary algorithm is not, that's not my opinion, it's been researched already. They are not good at meeting those targets. And by the way, nothing is good at meeting a target unless we verify, right? If you hit a button, whether it's NAL or DSL or Signias or anybody else, doesn't matter because we really didn't measure it based on their ear canal response. So now I'm going off a tangent, but my point is, for me, for my patients, for adults, I'm almost always going after NAL, NL2 because I know what to expect. There's been study after study after study. In fact, our own studies, we use NAL and L2 because we know how important it is to you, the audiologist, to be able to predict what the hearing instrument will do in a real-world kind of environment, minus our proprietary. Now, then maybe the question is, well, then what's the reason for a proprietary algorithm? Well, it may not be your goal to go after 100% audibility at first. Maybe this is a person with low empowerment and they were dragged into the office by their spouse already. So you're already having to work against those kinds of issues. And maybe the goal is just to get them to accept it. So maybe for that person, I would go after a proprietary algorithm because as we all know, it's lower gain. Usually with proprietary algorithms, they usually roll off the highs, manufacturers do. And the reason they do that is why? Acceptance. Acceptance, right? They want a high rate of acceptance by just pushing a button, the easy button. But we all know that that's not how audiology works, right? Ultimately, the goal should be that they meet those targets. And for me, as an audiologist, I know what to expect with a traditional algorithm like DSL version 5 and AL version 2. So I'll go fit that. And then I can expect what kind of SSI, for example, should I expect with this kind of fitting versus a proprietary that I don't know anything about. Does that make sense? Sorry if I gave you a very long answer. But I think it's important for audiology first. And so because manufacturers, the proprietary algorithm is a black box. Now, there are some systems where it allows you to even match to that proprietary algorithm using AutoFit. Anybody know what AutoFit is? Auto-REM fit? I have some slides, maybe we'll get to it. But again, if I fit to a manufacturer's proprietary algorithm and verify that using AutoREM fit, I don't know what to expect. And if I'm looking at a particular SSI index, at a particular articulation index, that's not published. So now I'm kind of in Never Never Land. What am I? Are they going to do well? Are they not going to do well? I don't know. So for you all who are after evidence-based practice and you want to know what to expect, I do recommend going with an algorithm that's been tested. Both DSL version 5 and L2 are excellent, and they're very similar, much more similar than there are differences between the two. So I hope I answered that question. Okay. Let's move on. Just some thoughts here, and if I get to it, I'll get to some auto-rem fit as well. But I just want to offer you some final thoughts on what we talked about in terms of the major point of the presentation. And number one really is about 90% of your patients are going to experience normal aging, as we witnessed with that dementia slide that I put up first. Our job is really to help them successfully go through that process of aging. And hopefully I've given you some tips here, just a few tips on how to do that. As a profession, we only typically measure a sliver of that lived experience by our patients. I think I've shown here that there are some ways to look at it more broadly, and through those self-reports that we talked about, the inventories that we talked about. And I think it's important to use validated self-reports, not the one that my PCC made because they had nothing to do one day and they decided to do some questionnaires, but ones that have been validated, they're reliable and valid over time, like the ones I showed you. So validated self-reports, and to actually be able to rely on what we mean by that lived experience, and then make it your mission to empower every single one of your patients. I think that's important to really take control of their, as I mentioned, challenges, their listening environment. Many of our patients are simply unaware that they can demand more of a better of an environment in their surroundings. They can ask people to, hey, let's go to a more quiet place. I have some hearing loss. Hey, when you talk to me, look at me. The teacher, I was asking here, have you ever talked to your students about having hearing loss? Do they even know you have one good ear and 50% of it at that? Instead of shouting and being embarrassed and then going back and forth, maybe just have a conversation with your students. Hey, I have some hearing loss. This is how you communicate with me. It's very likely that many of these issues in the very busy classroom with first graders, is not all of it. They're all, young and they want to have fun and make a lot of noise. But kids are excellent at accommodating those kinds of issues. They have very kind hearts. They're not like adults. And they will help you in those situations. Of course, adults will as well. But my point is, in a classroom, it's good for both sides of the aisle to be informed about how to communicate with one another with communication challenges. So it would be good to make that our mission. And then last thing I'll talk about just a little bit in detail here. I think everybody that fits hearing aids, that, those that are older, you need to know about these things, and some guidance is really important. So let me show you some guidelines. Speaking of guidelines, this was published in the UK last summer, June, I think. And of all places, in Frontiers of Neurology. So it wasn't an audiology group, but anyway, I'm sure you all have it on your nightstand, and are studying it. But this also has Harvey Dillon as one of the authors. Notice the title: Normal Aging and Older Adults. So this addresses this issue dead on. Anybody want to guess in terms of the criteria? What do they mean by an older adult? 65. That's one guess. Thank you. Anybody else? So there are aging effects happening in the 30s. Yeah. So yeah, I hate to think of myself that way, but that's what the research says. So basic idea is that, and what they found is that you age, the three things I talked about in terms of difficulties, they add distortion to the system. The hearing loss does. And of course, distortion to the auditory system. And last thing you want to do is add additional distortion when you fit hearing aids and even more problems. So they came up with some good recommendations in terms of limiting possible distortions to you fit patients. So I'll just kind of briefly go over these. First recommendation is to avoid settings that introduce distortion by keeping those compression ratios less than 2:1. Now, I'm not talking about each channel. So at Signia, I'll use us as an example. You know, there is 192 channels with a binaural system. I'm not talking about every single channel. I'm talking on the average. So less than 2:1. That is the recommendation, and I think that is not necessarily new, but I think intuitively we would all agree that any kind of processing or over-processing of the speech cues will affect those, the spectrum of speech that we're really interested in maintaining. Second recommendation, to consider using slow-acting compression, so longer release times with people. So you could do this on a second program, doesn't have to be in the universal program, but that is longer release times has been shown, especially for older adults, to have better outcomes in terms of being able to capture speech and understand it. Okay, so that's number 2. And then 3 is a smooth broadband amplification, so stable broadband amplification through 4,000 hertz. So this is, of course, the only way we do this is by real ear measurement, right? There's no software in the world where you can hit a button, and then, of course, on the software screen, everything is beautiful, right? Everything is right on top of each other, nice separation, looks sexy, but of course that has nothing to do with what's happening in the patient's ear. It's based on a KEMAR, usually an aided response, a simulated aided response rather than the patient's ear. So I think that goes without saying, but that's another recommendation that they have. And 4th is to improve the individual's SNR with directional microphone technology. Now, despite all of the AI-based noise reduction campaigns that are going on in the field, the last couple of years, really, we've lots of this stuff coming at us. But really, the only way to assure that the signal-to-noise ratio is going to improve with directional microphone technology, and there are only a couple of companies that use 4 microphone arrays to accomplish this. Signia is one of them. We've had lots of years in terms of wireless technology. I'm not going to go into that. But the communication between the hearing instruments and the technology that allows for them to go into advanced beamforming allows the hearing aid now, the latest technology, to not just focus on a single person in background noise, but directional technology now allows the hearing aid to focus on multiple conversation partners in background noise. And not just focus on them as in, oh, here's a person, and here's a person, and then there's a third, and maybe there's somebody in the back, but actually track, as in, if the speech of interest moves, or if multiple speech of interest move, tracks that speech and changes its directional pattern to focus on that particular speaker. So it doesn't just go off of signal-to-noise ratio. There's a lot of other calculations that happen in the background. We've had decades to kind of fine-tune this to come to this point. Things like dynamics of conversation, turn-taking, proximity, noise, speech with noise, speech without noise, all of these are working in the background to give these what we call multiple streams of directionality, not just towards the front, but in a background noise situation, you can have multiple people moving and speaking even at the same time, and the hearing aid will, in fact, lock onto the speech signal. Amazing technology. I don't know how we did it. I wish I had invented it. But we have lots of evidence. And I mentioned AI-based technology because we've had some marketing fluff out there that talks about noise reduction. But I invite you to test our hearing instruments. We have a white paper that was just published addressing that very same thing. And you be the judge on what system gives you better signal-to-noise ratio. I just talked about the benefit of this for the last hour and a half. That is the name of the game, is improving signal-to-noise ratio, and the most effective way to do that is using directionality, full stop. Okay, so let's see. I think we're up to 5 now. So using molds. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about because you're either on one side or another. I'll disclose to you that I'm a mold person. And now this is not my opinion. It is the best way to fit hearing aids. This isn't something that I deciphered. People who are way smarter than me have already determined this from a long time ago. And I think we would all agree that no matter what kind of disposable tip we put on there, and by the way, venting information with hearing aids are based on, so if you look at Harvey Dillon's work from a long time ago, he had actually a chart where he showed you the, back to Audiology 101 now, showed you the effect of venting with different types of vent in a parallel standard mold. That doesn't apply to disposable tips. I don't care if it's double flanged, triple flanged with a lock. If it's a disposable tip and it's not made for the patient's ear canal, you're going to have leaks. You're going to have leaks. My colleagues at Widex, actually, with Francis Cook's lab and our Orca lab in Chicago, did this work, and they showed that even with, like I said, double flange, what is called closed tips, you're still having 10 to 15 dB of leakage of sound because the tip, of course, isn't exactly the shape of the patient's. So better frequency response goes without saying. More stability, all of these are benefits of custom molds. I'm a big fan of custom molds for that purpose. Yes, it takes longer, but boy, do you get the advantage, and more importantly, the patient gets the advantage of having the best thing done for them in terms of signal-to-noise ratio, right? That's the game. If I have an open dome or even a closed dome that I think is closed, because that's what the software says, not only things can get out sound, but things can get in sound. So I'm doing all this hard work to deliver them this clean processed sound that is a better signal-to-noise ratio, but then all of this background noise is leaking in, and some of the noise is actually, the speech is leaking out. So I'm really shooting myself and the patient in the foot inadvertently, because that's what the software says. Oh, you're doing a great job. But try it yourself. Put a disposable tip and fit it to closed, and then check that in your verification system. Very likely that you may hit the higher frequency targets, mids and highs, but in the low frequencies you'll see that it'll start to drop down 6 dB, 10 dB because of the leakage. So custom molds, excellent way to fit hearing aids, and again, the patient is going to get a lot of advantage for that, but it's going to make your life a lot easier as well, I promise you. Okay. I think I have another question. I'm sorry.
How do you manage the complaints for occlusion?
How do you manage, the question was, how do you manage the occlusion effect, right? Well, I'll do another shameless plug. Signia has technology to calibrate for the patient's voice. We call it own voice processing. Does anybody use that, our own voice processing? Okay, thank you. So that is a good solution. Now, own voice processing, to be exact and to be fair, doesn't address the occlusion effect. It is, it's more of a, if you will, amp occlusion issue, right? So with own voice issue, now I'm going off topic, but forgive me, but with own voice issue, you have two parts to the own voice issue. You have the amplification of the patient's voice that they don't like. if you listen to your own voice on a voicemail or a video, have you ever noticed, like, wow, that doesn't sound like me at all? Why do I sound like that? It's because we're not using the normal pathway of bone and air conduction. One of them is missing, yeah? So the occlusion effect is the occlusion effect, right? Own voice processing may help. And what we've found is that of those people who dislike, these are first-time users, who dislike the naturalness or unnaturalness of the hearing aids as soon as you fit them, right? It's too sharp, I hear my own voice, it's too tinny, I'm in a barrel, I don't know how they know what the in a barrel sounds like, but my point is, if you take 100 of those individuals and run this calibration, this own voice processing calibration, 80 of them will flip. Test it yourself. It's not my opinion. This has been published already. Of 100 people, 80% will flip from dissatisfied to satisfied. So this amplification problem is a big issue. It's not always the occlusion effect. 20% of the time, maybe it is the occlusion effect. So I don't have data on that, so I don't want to misspeak. But I do have data on those people who are dissatisfied with the first fit unnaturalness of the voice or others. With this calibration, will flip. With occlusion effect, as you know, there are compromises. So if we open it up, we're risking what I mentioned is leakage. We're risking, feedback possibly. So it is kind of one of those things that we all hate, right? If the patient is able to tolerate a gradual increase in gain, again, I might go to a lesser gain strategy and gradually bring them up so the acclimatization process allows them to get used to it. But it is one of those things that we have to battle. I agree. Okay. All right, so how old do you think they were? But first of all, if you're younger than 40, you probably don't know who these people are. Who knows who these people are? Okay. All right, good. How old were they when this picture was taken? Early 50s, 40s? Any others? 65. Okay, that's probably the answer I would have given. So yeah, 48 and 44. So really not even 50. It's hard to believe, right? I think it's probably because, maybe they smoked more, they didn't take care of themselves, the socially acceptable things to do at those times. So I don't know exactly, but that's what aging looked like then. And this is what it looks like today. So Harrison Ford, of course, is almost double the age of Archie and Edith in his 80s. And, looks great. Anybody knows who the person is on the right? I'll give you a prize. You're close. It's Kitty Carlisle. So, no. But she was a very famous singer, and so 1930s. In fact, she was 96 years old when this was taken. So I think our job as professionals is really to help the person age successfully. This is what visually I think that looks like. But I think we've given you some information about how can we go about assessing, of course, patient-centered care, but it's not just the hearing test. It's not just the hearing aid. Let's get our patients to stop just thinking about that commodity, that piece of equipment, and really go after what we're all trained very well to do, which is addressing these different communication needs and the, if you will, items that affect the patient that are left essentially undiscovered, quote unquote, because we always kind of want to go quickly to the audiogram and fit the hearing aid. And maybe some of those challenges with background noise, challenges with social issues, psychological, physical issues that I mentioned, just gets left out in the dust because quickly we want to get them. Of course, hearing aids will give them benefit, but let's also look at some of these inventories to see how else we can bring that change about quicker, more effectively based on evidence. Okay. I think I have another 10 minutes. I'm going to very quickly go through, as I promised, AutoRem Fit. Who does AutoRem again? Anybody? Nobody. One person. Two people. I can't see online, but good on you. That's great. So first of all, AutoRem Fit is automatically matching your targets. The software does it for you. Okay? Now, I'll stop here and say, please make sure you know what the software is doing. Is the software doing the fitting, or is it the probe microphone equipment that's doing the fitting? That's important. We are seeing some patterns in the industry. This is not Signia, but we're seeing where you fit the patient to target. So you use NAL-NL2, for example, and then you verify that, and you see that it's not meeting targets. So my point is, you use the software, you click NAL-NL2 in the fitting software, you fit it, you verify it, and then you independently verify that fit without the hearing aid manufacturer's software, and it's lower than it should be. So this is unfortunate because what that means is these manufacturers are actually changing the traditional algorithm, in this case NAL-NL2. DSL, I don't think allows you to do that and continue to call it DSL version 5, but now does. I don't know if you knew that. But that's an important thing. But anyway, it is something that we've had, AutoRem Fit, for a long time. Let me give you some evidence. This is from 25 years ago. What you're seeing here, the real ear fitting of these were using 65 dB input targets, and the insertion gain using DSP hearing aids. So they were using the fitting software first fit, and then they matched it to DSL target curves using an average REUG. So this resulted in a nearly perfect fit on the software, but you can see what happened there on the top panel. And so that's what I mean, the difference between what the software is telling you and what your equipment, your probe microphone measurement equipment is telling you. And then, of course, then they did this auto-fit procedure. This is Gus Mueller's work, by the way. He was doing this 20 years ago. And so still, as you can see, there's only a handful of us that know about this. This, I won't go through all the research because I don't have the time, but this is valid and reliable. AutoRem is. Just know which equipment you're going to use. And research shows that AutoRem Fit is actually just as accurate as an experienced clinician, but takes 50% of the time less than it would take you to fit the hearing aid. Now, when I say 50% of the time less, I'm not talking about like opening the box and putting the molds on and like putting the batteries in. I'm talking about the actual fitting time. So if it takes you 7.5 minutes, 8 minutes to actually do the fitting manually, like back and forth, software, diagnostic equipment, software, recheck it. So it'll take you 3 minutes with AutoRem Fit. It automatically fits to target. And then depending on the equipment that you're using, it automatically fits to soft, average, and loud, or only average. Again, depending on the equipment. So you want to do a little investigation there. But do yourself a favor. That's what computers are for. We are in 2024, I think. let the computer do the work for you. Just need to do a little bit of homework on which ones to go with. I don't have a skin in the game. I'll tell you, VeriFit is an excellent system, but there are other excellent systems. It's not just VeriFit. I've used Oracle. They're just as good. I've used others. But it is important to know who's doing the fitting. Is it the manufacturer's software doing the fitting, or is it the probe microphone equipment that's doing the fitting? That's very important. So let me just quickly see if I can show you a video of this, because I think that would be fun to watch, if I can find it. So here's a picture of, this is from the Connect software, and this is after the procedure has been done. It's for a flat 40 response. And that took literally 2 minutes. It is not humanly possible to get that kind of a response manually in 2 minutes for both ears. It's doing them both at the same time. Here is another one for reverse mild loss. And by the way, I verified these. The audiology nerd that I am, I'm not satisfied with what the software is telling me, even though it's Signia software. I always check these things. And so I independently check that, and that's the independent checking. You can see it is dead on target. Again, manually, personally, my humble opinion, I don't think we could do this in 2 minutes. Save yourself time. I just talked about adding some inventories to your repertoire for your patients. This is a good way not to lose any time. To use auto-REM fit and then introduce maybe a fatigue scale or HHIE, whatever you feel is more conducive to your work and the way that you counsel your patients. Okay, let's see what I have here for you. So that is 65 curve, and that's the 80 curve. And that was what the screen looked like, the auto-REM screen. Let me see if I can get to the video. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through this because it's a long video, but let me just bring this to... Am I doing anything? Yes, okay. I'm going to jump here if I can. Yeah, for some reason my video is not working. Sorry, guys. Okay. I just want to go back to actually, okay, so here it is. It's actually done pretty much with its procedure, but when it starts off, it is a nightmare. And this is, again, any manufacturer, this is like hitting the first fit screen. You'll see how far these things were way off. And, the patient's like, oh, yeah, that's louder. I can hear everything great. But, of course, that's in the quiet office space that we have. As soon as they go out there, unless they're matched to target, they're going to have problems. They'll come back and complain about a particular environment, like in noise or in whatever. In quiet, I can't hear speech. This is an excellent tool to circumvent that. Let me see if I can go back to actually show you what it looked like before it started its procedure. Yeah, so there it is. You can see the mids and how off they are. And this is just the function of the patient's ear. Another patient's ear would probably totally be different because it's a different resonance. But this is a fantastic tool, ladies and gentlemen. I would use it. Myself, my colleagues under WSA umbrella, we're more than happy to discuss this with you and set the patient on a path of success. And this has been shown over and over again that satisfaction with effective real ear measurements way higher than hitting the first fit button and then hoping that things work out. I don't think I have to preach that to you. I think you're a great group of audiologists. So just wanted to show you that. With that, let me stop jabbering. Here's some references. Really a pleasure and an honor to be in front of you and present this information. Please don't hesitate to reach out. If there's anything I can do or I can provide any information, more than happy to do it. So wish you guys a fantastic rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much.